I don't think the most memorable scene of Resident Evil Village is the same as its scariest moment, but they do happen in the same chapter. There's little debate over the most frightening moment of the game. Deep in the basement of House Beneviento, you've been stripped of your guns and grenades and every other method of defense. The basement is generally a pretty spooky place, but that all gets cranked up to 11 when a scavenged fuse blacks out all the lights and you find a concerningly large umbilical cord connected to a concerningly even larger fetus. The thing looms out of the darkness in a scene more genuinely terrifying than anything the series has done before. For a relatively campy game, the monstrous baby in the basement of House Beneviento swerves into the realm of actual nightmares. For weeks after the game came out, conversations started with, "Have you got to that scene yet?" Oh, you'll know when you do. It is a perfectly constructed scare, a video game spook's Hall of Famer, but it's not the moment of the game I think about the most. That honor goes to a much quieter scene, a couple minutes before our encounter with the boss baby. Each section in Resident Evil Village is themed around its master, whether that's a tall vampire lady or a sad fish boy. In House Beneviento, that theme is dolls, mannequins, reminders of life. To even enter the house, you're forced to give up your own painful reminder. The doors won't open until you relinquish a photo of your dead wife and missing child. The doors swing open, you ride an elevator down into the depths of the house, and emerge in a room that has the most concerning reminder of all. Laying on the table, perfectly placid, is a mannequin of a woman with long, dark hair. If you hadn't already made the connection, the photo next to the mannequin makes it for you. It's a wooden imitation of Mia, your wife, the woman we know to be very dead. Given the genre and general goofiness of much of the game, it's fairly remarkable what the mannequin doesn't do. It doesn't ever scream, or get off the table, or grab you, or any of the horror cliches we might expect. It demonstrates an impressive amount of restraint for a game that's previously had you glue your hand back onto your arm. Instead, the wooden body mostly helps you solve puzzles. In purely mechanical terms, House Beneviento is kind of an escape room. Mia's mannequin holds a number of clues that you can use to open locked doors, solve riddles, and eventually escape. It's clever. But the way the scene plays out doesn't feel clever as much as intimate. This largely stems from how many pains are taken to physicalize the mannequin. Normally, to pick up items, you'd simply press a button and the bullets or whatever would just zoom into your inventory. Not here. Even removing a ring takes a surprising amount of time and effort. To find a key hidden in her leg, you run your hands up and down the limb, find the joint, slowly twist it off, and only then receive what's inside. Other puzzles ask you to cut open the bandages on her chest, inspect the back of her eye, or, what feels most transgressive of all, use tweezers to pull something out of her mouth. And while some of the clues you get from her are fairly abstract, others are explicit. A ring with your wedding date, a roll of film featuring your daughter. Resident Evil is no stranger to blasting dudes, or burning them, or making them fall off ski lifts. This, in contrast, is probably one of the least violent, least gory scenes of the whole franchise. But I think it sticks in my mind so stubbornly because it's an actual confrontation with a body after death. Not as a zombie, not undead, just dead. It's a mannequin, a thing made of wood, and yet by getting closer to it and interacting with it more than any other person in the game, all the while pulling out reminders of what life with that person used to be, it activates deep-seated feelings, buried anxieties. It stuck with me even more than the giant, monstrous baby that follows. It's not strictly correct to call our interactions with the mannequin in House Beneviento an autopsy. For one, of course, it's an inanimate object. Though it parallels a corpse, it's still a model made out of wood. Secondly, to get a little more nitpicky with our definition, an autopsy is specifically to determine cause of death and/or the extent of changes produced by disease. If an anatomy class takes apart a cadaver as part of their curriculum, that's a dissection, not an autopsy. And at least at that part of Village's story, we're not curious how Mia died. It seems unfortunately obvious. But unlike a classroom dissection, the process of taking apart the wooden body reveals many things we did not expect. If the mannequin is Mia, then our disassembly of her demonstrates that we did not know this person as well as we thought. It's not just a mechanical puzzle box, it's a narrative one as well. How much more was this body hiding? A rather shocking fact about real autopsies is how often they reveal a misdiagnosed cause of death. Various studies say that somewhere between 25 to 40% of autopsies show causes of death other than what the person was officially diagnosed with. In about a third of these cases, a more accurate diagnosis could have extended that person's life via more effective treatment. Even more striking, this number hasn't really changed since 1940. Even with all our new medical tech, autopsies reveal misdiagnoses at the same rate that they did almost a century ago. Now, the social researcher in me can't let those statistics stand uncontextualized. The total rate of autopsies has plummeted since the mid-20th century, and so it follows that the relatively few done today would be done on less clear-cut cases. The takeaway here shouldn't be that we haven't improved our diagnostic tools in the last century. But one study estimates that even if today's autopsy rate were 100%, meaning every person who died was autopsied, we'd still find that about 4% of all causes of death were misdiagnosed. That's incorrectly attributing the cause of death 1 out of every 25 times. That's a lot. I don't share these stats to roast doctors. One, there are so many other things I could roast doctors for. Are you kidding me? Two, autopsies are also done by doctors. Being a medical examiner, being licensed to perform autopsies, requires a medical degree. Instead, I tell you those statistics because they're a quantifiable part of a hard-to-quantify subject area. You can't assess the value of an autopsy by the patient's quality of life because they're dead. Autopsies are not done for the benefit of the corpse. Instead, the hope is that they benefit the living, to reassure or give new information to loved ones or to gain greater insight into vague symptoms. On a societal level, autopsies are actually a sort of preventative care. They identify trends that are killing people in the present, and we can ideally use that information to prevent the same things from killing people in the future. Medical examiners working with the dead may be the first people to report data on spiking drug overdoses, for instance, or the reappearance of measles. They're the ones who have eyes on the crises of next year. At the same time, though, an autopsy is not a procedure done between a medical examiner and a grieving family, or a curious clinician, or society. It's between a medical examiner and a dead body. As far-ranging as their influence can be, the process is interpersonal, I guess. A lot about autopsies feels contradictory, oxymoronic. They're a medical procedure, but probably the only one where recovery isn't a concern. People working in the field will seem calloused in their casual relation to the dead while simultaneously taking care of them in a more real way than any of us likely will. Examiners cut indelicately and stitch back together haphazardly. I've read several euphemisms for opening up a body that I will not repeat here. They use tools of surgery in ways that occasionally feel more akin to a butcher. If the body needs to be presentable for a viewing, signs of death and decay can be hidden with methods that feel analogous to how fast food is prepared for an advertisement. My favorite of these oxymorons is that sometimes medical examiners, especially when investigating deaths outside of hospitals, are referred to as the last of the first responders. They are called, writes reporter Jordan Kisner, only after a life or death situation has reached its definitive conclusion. Culturally, I think it's safe to say that most of our interaction with autopsies are through crime fiction. It's a staple bit of any procedural, a classic piece of Law & Order or CSI.
So whoever did this was angry?
Hey, I just cut him open. You want motive, talk to a shrink.
It is, as with most things in the genre, relentlessly unrealistic and stylized and embellished upon. It's also a classic symptom of our obsession with crime. Far more people die in hospitals than in unsolved criminal activity, and yet we're far more likely to watch TV autopsies of knife wounds and poisonings than aortic aneurysms. But I can't judge it too harshly, because my favorite writing about an autopsy, my #1 investigation of a corpse, also comes from a cop procedural. More specifically, the game Disco Elysium. One of the first things you discover in Disco Elysium, before your amnesiac cop protagonist even remembers his name, is that there's a body hanging from a tree. It's one of the few certainties you get early on, and the precipitating incident for basically the entire plot. There is a body, and it's in a tree. Lavishing praise on Disco Elysium's writing feels almost redundant at this point, but one of the incredible things about the game's script is that it manages to communicate almost every tone simultaneously. Because many of the game's conversations are between different aspects of the protagonist's personality, scenes revel in cognitive and tonal dissonance. Your sense of empathy may tell you one thing, and your sense of authority screams the exact opposite. The blunter aspects of your psyche crack jokes, while the sensitive ones struggle to hold themselves together. And as it happens, this fragmented inner self lends itself near perfectly to the inherently contradictory act of examining a corpse. Your interactions with the hanged man are lengthy. A perfectly successful sequence will last over an hour. Failures will prolong the experience even longer, as you're forced to find alternative methods to solve the various problems that present themselves. The examination can be roughly broken into 2 chunks. A purely visual inspection while he hangs, and then a much more involved field autopsy once he's been brought to the ground. The first thing the scene presents is revulsion, and it remains throughout. Before you can even start the inspection, the first challenge is to not vomit at the sight and smell of the man, a challenge most players are likely to fail. The writing does not spare us any detail. Some parts bulge and others ooze, skin marbles and veins decay. And yet, and I think this is the balancing act that maintains the entire scene, the writing never feels judgmental towards the body. The aspects of its decay aren't framed as some ethical metaphor, but immutable parts of the cycle of life. Although the protagonist occasionally mentally refers to the corpse as the monster, the title doesn't really stick. His flares of anger at the hanging man are little more than projections of his own insecurities. Ultimately, the autopsy is almost tender. The protagonist's eccentricities more often manifest in oddly compassionate acts, stroking the corpse's hair, holding his hand. Even the coarsest elements of your personality, like pain threshold, refer to him poetically.
Before you is a temple of pain that knew little tenderness in life.
No matter who he was in life, both you and your ever-professional partner Kim seem to sense that the body doesn't deserve scorn in death. Even still, it's hard to make the process graceful. Your intrusions into the man's body create sounds like the creaking of an old house at night, and the continued decay of the body never becomes easier to stomach. Nor does the thoroughness of your autopsy give meaning to his death. Searching vainly for a moral to the situation, our protagonist declares, "The brain is vulnerable to compromises in its blood supply," which your partner dryly remarks,
"I think that may well be the moral of every story, officer."
Because of Disco Elysium's relatively unique structure, a game about one death instead of hundreds, it's able to give this body the weight it deserves. A grotesque object, a beautiful one, a symptom of decay, a record of a life. The more death that exists in a piece of media, the broader the brushstrokes have to be, vast swaths of humanity summed up in a few shots or a single sentence. In contrast, this story is able to lean into every intricacy, every contradiction of a single person. The most electrifying part of the process is entirely missable, a dice roll on a hunch at the very end. After filling every official checkbox, the protagonist can opt for one more inspection of the dead man's mouth, feeling his way through heretofore unseen injuries and ultimately pushing through to the corpse's brainstem, the closest you get to touching who he was, at the same time you find what actually killed him. The scene seems to run in slow motion. The former roles of each part of the brain get as much writing as their present decomposition. It's a moment that provides a thrilling amount of information on the larger story, though it will still take dozens of hours to contextualize your finding in the narrative. What I've neglected to mention thus far is the supernatural element. Multiple times in the autopsy, and indeed throughout the game, the hanged man speaks. To you, specifically, not Kim nor anyone else.
I'm a joke. Look at me. There is nothing funny about jokes either.
It's not really supernatural. The corpse tells you that this is probably all your imagination, and for what it's worth, your necktie agrees with him.
Yeah, man! Don't be crazy! Inanimate objects and dead people can't really talk to you! Your wild imagination is doing this!
As such, the hanged man doesn't provide much information that's fully new. Instead, he forces more of the introspection our protagonist has been trying to avoid and encourages your wilder guesses. But as supernatural as it is, this element echoes the experience of actual medical examiners. Kisner writes about one woman whose autopsy of a man revealed a shocking neglect from his caretakers. The examiner explicitly said that the greatest part of her job was that she was able to be his voice, to advocate for him when he wasn't able to anymore. While I talked about the cumulative use of autopsy data, I can't ignore how meaningful it can also be on an individual level. In a way, it's the last chance a person has to really communicate. They can tell their story in a way only possible after they've passed. It's a concept that's beautifully expressed in, I hate to say it, the book Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card. I have to preface this by saying that Card is a huge piece of shit, an early example of a YA author who should have just shut the hell up online. He's a climate change denier, a war hawk, an old school homophobe. He sucks. You shouldn't buy new copies of his books. I got mine from the library. But Speaker for the Dead, as best as I can tell, does not carry the same flaws as its author, and its take on the topic of death and communication and the stories told by a body is too poignant for me to ignore. The title, Speaker for the Dead, is a concept originated in the book's predecessor, Ender's Game. Following the extinction of an alien species, the main character, Ender Wiggin, writes a book memorializing the species' existence. It's not meant to be a romanticization nor a condemnation of their lives, but simply an understanding, said with full candor, hiding no faults, pretending no virtues. Ender's book, authored under the name Speaker for the Dead, is persuasive enough that speaking for the dead becomes a tradition. People incorporate it into their mourning. A speaker gives voice to often painful truths, but in doing so offers a greater sense of closure. The act of speaking for the dead is painted as a kind of verbal autopsy, using someone's death as a final chance to learn from their life. In our book, Speaker for the Dead, the autopsy analogy is taken one step further. The story is set on a distant planet, one that humans share with a newly discovered alien species. Although the humans are in communication with them, many aspects of the alien life cycle remain completely mysterious, and the mystery turns dire after two humans are found dead and apparently vivisected, their skin split open and veins splayed out into the ground. Ender arrives on the planet long after these occurrences, called from light years away to speak for the dead and dissected. What he finds is even more complex, though, a tangled web of human connections, pain and neglect and repressed emotions, all stemming from the inability to deal with even one death, let alone a series of them. To effectively speak for just one of the dead requires a comprehensive understanding of both societies, the humans and the aliens, and their post-mortem secrets. Several characters in the story have secrets they're determined to take to the grave. Some, in fact, did. But to fully appreciate how they lived, Ender has to understand what they died for, a quest that takes him right back to the vivisections that began this whole sequence of events. Spoilers follow, by the way. Much of the hurt and confusion from the characters in the story ultimately stems from the fact that they fundamentally don't understand how the aliens die, or what becomes of them afterward. What Ender uncovers is what initially looked like torturous deaths, the disassembly of their body, is actually a vital part of how they live, a living autopsy that allows for their continued consciousnesses to bolster their community. So although the aliens were responsible for vivisecting the two humans, they did so in an attempt to honor them, bring them into the community. And the humans, in turn, found themselves unable to conceptualize the splaying of the bodies as anything except extreme violence. Each group couldn't understand the other in life because they could not understand the other in death. Only at the very end, through painstaking communication about how each species lives and dies, are the two disparate communities able to fully appreciate each other and themselves. It is not an easy process. It actually results in more intense mourning than either group previously allowed themselves, but it's a mourning built of truth, not of confusion, and as such, it begins the path of healing. In a way, the catharsis that comes with the comprehension in Speaker for the Dead and Disco Elysium also explains why the mannequin in Resident Evil Village is so unsettling. Village provides an example of an autopsy that answers nothing, suggesting how you might take apart a loved one without ever answering why. The issue doesn't only exist in fiction. Doing research, I always feel like I learn about a crisis I had previously never heard of, and here's this videos. There is an extreme shortage of medical examiners across the US. Fewer than 500 forensic pathologists in the whole country, each of whom face an accelerating workload as more deaths, particularly drug-related, demand more autopsies. The most obvious reason for this shortage is money. Salaries are high for a normal person, but low compared to the other things you could do after a decade of medical training and its ensuing debts. But as Jordan Kisner writes, there are more socially enforced reasons for the shortage as well. We are suspicious of those who deal with the dead. Why go to medical school for so long if you're not invested in helping people recover? Why spend money on the deceased when it could go to the living? I hope you recognize the flaws in this logic by now. The corpses don't need any money. They're done. They did it. They can chill. What this money goes to is solely for our living benefit, finding out the last things they have to tell us, using the dead's warnings to prevent future harm. Author Mary Roach writes that cadavers are our superheroes. They don't endure anything. What a shame to waste these powers, to not use them for the betterment of humankind. What a strange gift to be given at the end of life, the opportunity to send one more message, the ability to help after everything is over. What an unexpected blessing for us to be able to learn from a loved one final time. God, the transitions for these things are always so weird. Because I'm not a medical doctor, I did a lot of research for this video. Some of it was super interesting. A lot of it was very dry. As it often happens, my favorite source, the book Stiff by Mary Roach, only ended up getting a single quote in the video, but hey, this video was sponsored by Audible, so now you get to hear more about it. Stiff is an audiobook for all of you who watch this video and thought, I wish he was funnier and way more explicit with his descriptions. It's an investigation of all the wild things cadavers can do and the people who choose to work with them. Every chapter is absolutely fascinating. Composting, crucifixions, cannibalism, great topics to bring up at dinner. And throughout, Roach is hilariously candid about the situation she finds herself in. The whole book just flew by for me. And it can for you too, because Audible.com/Jacob Geller specifically. Audible has basically every audiobook you could ever want, easy to use on your various devices, and they give you those books free. When you sign up with my URL or text Jacob Geller to 500-500, you'll get a whole month of the service and Stiff by Mary Roach on the house. I mean, you could get a book other than that. That's just the one I think you should get. If you've been following my Audible recommendations for a while, you will have an incredibly neat collection of listening material. If you're just starting out, why not check out these other ones as well? Each is narrated excellently, easily broken into several chunks for commutes or chores, and I don't know, you'll be smarter after listening to them. Just try one out. The first month and book is totally free. To start, go to audible.com/Jacob Geller or text Jacob Geller to 500-500.